As students of behavior analysis, we conducted a replication of a single subject study involving food acceptance. During this presentation, we will review the original study, supporting literature, methods of our replication, results, concluding comments, and limitations of the study. My name is Jessica Biggs. We also have Jamie Boer, Leah Chung, Denise Kieta, and Megan Rapassi. To begin, I will review the original study. The study by Meyer, Freiling, and Wallace from 2012 was titled Using High Probability Foods to Increase the Acceptance of Low Probability Foods. The purpose of the study was to evaluate the effects of using a high probability sequence on acceptance of low preference foods. The subject was a girl named Ronnie, who was a 3-year-old who had been diagnosed with autism. Her family described her as a picky eater and chose foods that they often ate as a family and wanted her to eat with them. These foods were plums, raspberries, and eggplant. The high preference foods that were used were bananas and baked beans. To begin the study, the researchers began with a baseline where they tested her acceptance of the low preference foods by themselves. Then they began the treatment phases, which began with a 3-to-1, 3 bites of a high probability food to 1 bite of the low probability food, going down to 2 of high probability to 1 low probability, and then 1-to-1, and finally 0-to-1, or return to baseline. They showed increased acceptance of all low preference foods. For the acceptance of plums and raspberries, this was reached 100% in the return to baseline and follow-up phases. However, the acceptance for eggplant only reached 100% in the 3-to-1 phase.
So now let's review other literature. Feeding and autism, is it really a problem? Schreck, Williams, and Smith, 2004, sought out to compare feeding problems of typically developing children and children with autism. They hypothesized that children with autism had more feeding and feeding-related problems than typically developing children. They gathered 472 participants between the ages of 5 and 12 years old. For the methods, the parents were given the Children's Eating Behavior Inventory, which was to identify the problem behaviors that the child displayed while eating. Next, the parents completed the Food Preference Inventory. This step assisted in identifying what types of foods the children eat compared to what the family eats. Lastly, the parents filled out the Gilliam Autism Rating Scale. This is where the experimental and control group were identified and split up. The experimental group consisted of children on the autism spectrum, and the control group consisted of typically developing children. They found that children with autism have more feeding problems than typical developing children. Children with autism also refuse food more frequently. They eat significantly less types of food, and they only eat foods of certain textures in comparison to typically developing children. The findings by Schreck et al. 2004 confirmed their original hypothesis.
What is behavioral momentum? Behavioral momentum refers to the tendency for behavior to persist following a change in environmental conditions, as defined by Rizzio and Bafori. We want our learners to become accustomed to respond to easy requests, so over time they can respond to more difficult requests that are placed. And as always, we want to provide reinforcement during our interventions, and the greater behavioral momentum, the greater reinforcement. Behavioral momentum should not be used as a physical consequence for shaping behavior. Stimulus feeding has also been used as a strategy for promoting long-term compliance gain after the use of high P sequence request. Supporting literature for behavioral momentum. Behavioral momentum has been used as a fluency building procedure to enhance educational outcomes. It was acknowledged by Kelly and Holloway 2014 that behavioral momentum is used to investigate the acquisition, retention, stability, endurance, and the application of text learned to a fluency aim. So this would include task modification for our learners. That way we can provide frequent reinforcement opportunities as we continue to teach new skills. And we also have supporting literature from Davis, Williams, and Hamilton, 1992, supporting that behavioral momentum is used as an antecedent strategy, primarily used to increase compliance and also reduce self-injurious behavior and stereotypy. Antecedent procedures include a rapid series of short and easy requests given before a more difficult request, so it does not omit the correct response. High probability response sequences occur prior to more difficult responses, and the literature also has mentioned that these type of procedures have been used with children who have severe behavioral issues.
The article written by Ray, Skinner, and Watson, 1999, set out to increase the compliance of demands for a student. The student displayed high rates of compliance with his mom and low rates of compliance with his teacher when a demand was placed on him. For this study, mom served as a high probability in compliance to demands, whereas the teacher served as a low probability in compliance to demands. For the methods, the student was exposed to 9 different phases in which the high probability was gradually faded and the low probability was gradually increased. The high probability and low probability varied through the phases, and time delays were also integrated in some of the phases. Now, this is how our study by Meyer et al. 2012 is unique to the study. Our study consisted of varied high probability sequences, meaning that we had 3, 2, and 1 high probability, and our low probability didn't vary. It was 1 throughout all of the phases, the entire study. The Ray et al. 1999 study found that the behavior momentum procedure was successful in transferring compliance from the mother to the teacher. Additionally, the rates of responding for the teacher increased throughout the phases and maintained high rates of responding at the conclusion of the study.
Purpose of the replication. The purpose of the study conducted by Meyer, Freiling, and Wallace, 2012, was to evaluate the effects of using a high probability, high P sequence with preferred foods in order to improve acceptance of foods that were previously refused at one time, or low P. In comparison, the purpose of our replication is to evaluate the effects of using high probability foods to increase the acceptance of low probability foods. By increasing acceptance of low probability foods, we hope to expose ourselves to a variety of healthy foods and to help allow individuals fully participate in family meals and consume a more balanced diet long term.
We'll go into the methods now. Our participants included 5 graduate and level of females ages 21 to 29 pursuing a master's degree in applied behavioral analysis. Jessica, Jamie, Leah, Denise, and Megan. The materials we used were high probability and low probability foods varied by participant, a recording device such as a cell phone or computer, a timing device, stopwatch or cell phone, and tableware, including spoons, forks, knives, and plates. The setting took place at home or work for each participant. Behavior definition, food acceptance, is inserting the food into the individual's mouth and chewing and swallowing. This does not include inserting food into one's mouth and spitting it out. Acceptance of a food is defined as inserting food into one's mouth, chewing the food, and swallowing the entire bite. Non-acceptance is defined as which includes gagging, coughing, grimacing, or refusing, which is pushing away a plate, or verbal outbursts, or clenching jaw closed, which does not allow food to enter the mouth while chewing and swallowing the food. Data collection and design. Study was conducted as a multiple baseline design. 10 trials will be conducted per phase. Criteria was reached when participants successfully accepts food item 80% of trials over 3 consecutive days. Baseline consisted of 1 bite of low probability food consumed alone 10 times. 3 high probability is 3 bites of high probability food with 1 bite of low probability food 10 times. 2 high probability is 2 bites of high probability food consumed with 1 bite of low probability food 10 times. And 1 high probability food consumed with 1 bite of low probability food 10 times. A plus was recorded when participants successfully consumed low probability food, and a minus was recorded when the participant rejected low probability food. The baseline procedure, only low probability foods were consumed. Foods will be prepared for safe consumption and will cut up into 1 to 1.5 centimeter cubes. We'll present the food, place on a fork on a plate, and we'll give the SD take a bite. If a bite is accepted, a plus will be recorded, verbal praise will be delivered, and next trial will resume after 15 seconds. If a bite is refused, expelled, or is pushed away within 6 seconds, a minus will be marked, and the next trial will resume after 15 seconds. Trials will continue until all 10 trials of each low probability food are completed.
To demonstrate how the baseline procedure was implemented, we are going to show you one of our baseline recordings. The following video is of myself, Megan, eating and recording baseline data for olives, a low probability food.
Oh. Fine. Can't do olives. Oh my god, that was awful. Bye. Oh my god. Bye. Bye. Oh. What? Oh. Bye. Oh. It's fine. Yeah. Need your drink. That one. I refuse that one. Oh, I'm gonna take
After baseline was stable for each participant, we moved into our intervention phases. During the intervention phases, bites of high probability foods were eaten before a bite of low probability foods. The high probability foods were chosen by each participant as a food they enjoyed to eat. The food that was eaten, both the high and low probability foods, were prepared so that they were safe to eat. For example, they were cooked thoroughly if raw, and were cut into 1 to 1.5 centimeter pieces. High probability food was eaten by participants themselves without someone administering bites and without a verbal SD. Low probability foods were introduced the same way as baseline, with someone giving the SD, take a bite. Each intervention phase met criteria for moving on when the participant consumed an N amount of high probability food plus a low probability food bite, 80% or more over 3 consecutive sessions. For example, they consume 3 bites of a high probability food plus 1 bite of a low probability food at 80% for 3 sessions. Phases moved from eating 3 bites of high probability food to 2 high probability foods, 1 high probability food, then returned to baseline where the participant no longer ate a bite of a high probability food prior to the low probability bite. Just as baseline, accepted bites were recorded as a plus and non-acceptance was recorded as a minus. Each session lasted 10 trials. Similar to our baseline example video, we are going to show you a video of Leah eating olives, her low probability food of choice, for the intervention phase of 1 high probability food plus a low probability food bite.
Eat it. Good job. 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 Eat it. Good job.
The next section to discuss is treatment fidelity and inter-observer agreement. To ensure treatment fidelity among all participants, 20% of sessions were recorded and viewed by another group member. This allowed us to answer questions about the intervention among participants if needed. This also ensured that sessions were being run correctly when some sessions were run in the absence of another household member or instructor to help give the SD take a bite. The sessions that were recorded for treatment fidelity were also used to calculate IOA among all participants. IOA scores will be discussed in the results section.
Now we will discuss the results. Our first participant is me, Jessica. My low preference foods were broccoli, asparagus, and kiwi. I used high preference foods of pizza and applesauce. My total inter-observer agreement was 99.33%. As you can see in the graphs, my acceptance for broccoli and kiwi varied in the baseline, but then increased to 100% across the rest of the phases. And asparagus started at 0% acceptance, but then also increased to 100% in the other phases of the study. Here you can see the data averages and ranges. Broccoli started with an average acceptance of 32% and quickly increased to 100%. Kiwi started with an average acceptance of 26% in baseline and increased to 100%. Asparagus started with 0% acceptance and increased to 100% as well. Our next participant is Jamie. Her low preference foods were eggplant, asparagus, and sweet potato. Her high preference foods were strawberries and string cheese. Her inter-observer agreement was 95.33%. All foods started with a varied acceptance in baseline and then increased throughout the phases, and she was able to get 100% acceptance by the end of the second baseline for all foods. Here are her data averages and ranges. Eggplant started at 34% acceptance average and gradually increased to 100% acceptance in the 1 high probability and no high probability phases. Asparagus started at 26% acceptance and gradually increased, where it reached 100% by the end of the study. Sweet potato started with an average acceptance of 40% and increased to 100% as well. Leah is our next participant. Her low preference foods were broccoli, tuna, and olives. Her high preference foods used were chocolate chips and strawberries, and her inter-observer agreement was 95.33%. Her initial acceptance for all food was low and varied slightly, and then she quickly increased and was able to reach 100% acceptance during the high probability 1 and baseline 2 phases. Here are her data averages and ranges. Broccoli started with 24% acceptance in baseline and quickly increased to 100%. Tuna started with an average baseline of 16% and gradually increased and reached 100%. Olives started with an acceptance of 20% average and increased to 100% acceptance as well. Our next participant is Denise. Her low preference foods were Brussels sprouts, peppers, and prunes, and her high preference foods were tortilla chips and strawberry yogurt. Her IOA was 96%. Her acceptance during baseline for all foods varied and continued to generally increase, where she reached 100% at the end of the study. Here are her data averages and ranges. Brussels sprouts started with an average acceptance of 56% and increased to 100% over time. Peppers started with an average of 60% during baseline acceptance and increased where it reached 100%. Prunes started with an average acceptance of 42% and gradually increased until it reached 100%. Our last participant is Megan. Her low preference foods were olives, beets, and tofu. Her high preference foods were clementines and Reese cups, and her IOA was 100%. Her acceptance at the beginning baseline phase were varied and fairly low, but quickly increased, and all foods reached 100% in the final baseline 2 phase. Here are her data averages and ranges. Baselines for olives started at 10% acceptance and quickly increased until it reached 100% in both the 1 high probability and no high probability. Beets started with an acceptance of 14% average and gradually increased and eventually reached 100%. Tofu started with an average of 20% acceptance and quickly increased, where she had acceptance of 100% in all treatment phases.
Based off of our results, many conclusions can be drawn. The data shows that for each participant, the acceptance of low probability foods increased after baseline when high probability foods were introduced and consumed prior. Pairing high probability foods with low probability foods had a positive effect on the food acceptance across all participants. Consuming high probability foods seems to increase the chance of consuming low probability foods. During baseline, there was a wide range of low probability food acceptance between the participants. Acceptance ranged from 0% to 100% depending on the food being consumed and the participant consuming such food. For example, during baseline of Brussels sprouts for Denise, she accepted food at 20% for session 1, then jumped to 100% for acceptance during session 2, and then for session 3 dropped it back down to 60%, showing a wide range of acceptance from session to session, seen across multiple participants. During phase 2, the 3 high probability foods, acceptance of foods drastically increased for most participants. For example, during baseline for Jessica, her consumption of broccoli ranged from 20 to 40%, but when 3 bites of her high probability foods were consumed prior to a bite of broccoli, she could accept bites at 100% of the time across 5 sessions. Similar jumps in acceptance were seen among the other participants as well, with rates ranging from 30 to 100%. As the phases continue to decrease in the amount of high probability bites consumed, for example, during the 2 high probability and 1 high probability food phases, the acceptance of low probability food continued to stay high. During the 2 high probability and 1 high probability phases for all participants, Megan, Leah, Denise, Jessica, and Jamie, acceptance ranged from 70% to 100% acceptance. Once returned back to baseline, or the last phase where no high probability food was consumed prior to low probability foods, all participants were accepting food from a range of 90 to 100% for at least 5 consecutive sessions. Although all participants showed an increase in acceptance of low probability foods and were able to accept some foods 100% of the time, Jessica had shown the biggest improvement and the biggest jump in the shortest amount of time. During baseline for broccoli, kiwi, and asparagus, she ranged from 0 to 50% of acceptance. Once phase 2, the 3 high probability foods began, she accepted bites at 100% for each food for all sessions and phases for the rest of the intervention. The results of the intervention show how pairing high probability foods with low probability foods helps in increasing the chances of eating foods you may not prefer or do not like. Even when decreasing the intake of high probability foods, acceptance continued. There are possible reasons for why the increase in acceptance could be. As sessions continue, we may have started to acquire the taste of a low probability food. We became used to the taste even though we may not have liked it. Also, during the initial phases, the taste of the high probability food could have still been in our mouths while taking a bite of low probability food, making it easier to consume. And we may have also learned that we like the taste of the low probability food, but maybe we're always too hesitant or scared to branch out and try something new. There are several possible limitations in regards to our study and its implementation. These limitations are both similar to the original study's limitations and our own limitations that occurred during our implementation of the study. The first is time constraints. Due to the number of phases and the amount of data points needed before moving on to subsequent phases, multiple trials had to be run during a single day. By having to do multiple sessions in a day, results could have been affected due to prior experience with that food already that day, such as experiencing the taste or texture multiple times. With busy schedules between all of us as participants, it was difficult to find time in the day to implement the study. While many of us wanted to try to run a session at lunch during the workday, we often did not have time. We were running from client to client or had work-related issues that we had to attend to, limiting the time available to run sessions. The second limitation is the availability of an implementation partner. Due to many participants living alone, the procedure had to be implemented by oneself and recorded for treatment to ensure treatment fidelity and inter-observer agreement. Although it was recorded, telling oneself to take a bite rather than another person could change the way food was accepted or change the results of that session itself. The third limitation is naturally motivating operations. Similar to the original study, naturally occurring motivating operations could have affected a participant's ability to accept low probability foods. For example, if a participant had just eaten dinner or another meal, they may be too full and less likely to accept bites of a food they do not like. On the other hand, if we had just gotten home from work and we are starving, we may be more likely to eat any food that is placed in front of us, increasing the chances of eating a low probability food that we do not like. Another aspect might affect this as well. If someone just had dinner, although they're full, they may have enjoyed their dinner a lot, and the taste of that food might still be in their mouth or in their mind, and they may be able to eat that food they do not like with more acceptance as well. Controls were not implemented to keep a person from eating right before a session began due to busy and varying schedules. If we had tried to control for this MO, the results could have varied. The fourth limitation is our food acceptance definition. Our definition of food acceptance is clear and concise, yet it involved non-acceptance as any facial expression of disgust while eating the low probability foods. Even if the food was eaten, but faces were made during the chewing and swallowing, it was to be marked as a negative. The results may look different if the faces could be made while swallowing the food, and we could mark it as an acceptance. The last limitation is our food preference assessments. Modifications were made from the original study for our version of the preference assessment. We did not conduct an actual assessment on foods we liked and disliked. Rather, we listed our favorite foods and our least favorite foods and chose those to use in the study. Although we may know as adults what we like to eat and do not like to eat, a preference assessment could have been implemented to ensure which foods we did and did not prefer. By choosing the foods we liked by making a list rather than assessment could have helped vary the results.
Thank you for watching our presentation over our study replication. On the following slides, you will see our references.